Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Klein. I'm the Director of Structural Engineering for VHB in Rhode Island, and I'm the President of the Rhode Island section of ASCE. Thank you all for joining us remotely. While in-person events have been postponed, we're happy to be able to provide these virtual events. Today, we're joined remotely by Larry Smith, who will be presenting his topic on engineering ethics. A little bit about Larry before he gets started. Larry has been involved with the Rhode Island section of ASCE for over 35 years. During that time, he has provided our group with a number of well-received talks. Larry has a strong background in ethics. He is currently on the board of directors of the National Institute of Engineering Ethics and is also a national governor of the Order of the Engineer. He has lectured on ethics at various local universities for well over 20 years. Larry will discuss a number of cases, such as the Citi Group Building, the Ford Pinto case, and the GMC ignition case, by first discussing the engineering issues and then discussing the ethical questions. He will also present a local case based on based on ethics complaint that was heard by the Rhode Island Board of Registration for Professional Engineers in open session. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today, Larry Smith.
Thank you. As a little background on this talk, first I'd like to thank Professor Leon Thien, who videotaped the sections that we're going to be showing, and we'll have a live discussion in between. To Leon's credit, we had two cameras. One was a good camera, and the backup was his phone. And the good camera, we set marks on the chalkboard, in which I was supposed to stay between so everything be centered. And we adjusted for height. And naturally, that video didn't come out, so we ended up with the backup from his phone. So I look like the headless horseman at times, but I'm sure you don't mind that. That being said, the way this talk originally started, for years I had been lecturing to the capstone class at URI on ethics, and we showed National Institute of Engineering Ethics video and then lead a discussion. Well, they moved into the new engineering building and went down there to give the talk. We found out that the projectors weren't hooked up yet. So it was Professor Thien, Chris Duhamel, the adjunct, myself, and I said, you know what, let me wing it. I just discussed some classic cases off the cuff, and Leon said it was much better, it was spontaneous, it was more interesting. Chris Duhamel expressed his disbelief that someone in their mid to late 70s could come down and talk off the cuff and be authoritative for almost an hour. And I told Chris that it's easy to be authoritative when you speak off the cuff and there's nobody there to correct you. But, by the way, Chris is also the one who expressed disbelief that I was able to add and subtract numbers in the traffic distribution chart of a roundabout presented by a member of the capstone class. And I was able to do all the math in my head and point out to the young man that either his calculations were wrong or in the center of the roundabout they were manufacturing 92 cars a day and slipping them out into the traffic. So we got that going. And one other thing, we had an ABET visitation after that. And the civil evaluator, who was supposed to be hard-nosed, we were sitting at lunch, and Professor Thiem on one side and I was on the other. And he asked Leon, what do we do for ethics? And Leon told him that Larry lectures, and this year he lectured about the Citi Group Building. And the guy started jumping up and down, getting all excited. And it turns out he was a graduate student of the key engineer in this whole thing. And couldn't believe that we were actually teaching it. Thought it was wonderful. And the after lunch session went a lot better with him. And we got full evaluation. And after I made this presentation, I actually saw something late at night on one of the engineering channels. And it was a presentation on the building. I watched it with bated breath. And I found out that I hadn't actually said anything wrong. I learned a couple of things. So with that, why don't we have Chad start work, doing some video.
Of course, the video works smoothly when we do it in the dry run, but right now the audio is not working, so we're gonna work on that. Still no audio, unfortunately, Chad. So Larry, you mentioned, speaking off the cuff. You may have to do this presentation off the cuff.
We'll need the diagram, I guess. So I think Chad needs to be up on the viewing screen for him to put it on with the audio.
Okay.
So I think he needs to join us on the side.
Welcome, Chad.
Try speaking, Chad.
Institute of Engineering Ethics.
There you go, Chad.
I had a fellowship in engineering ethics in the 1970s.
Start at the beginning.
Humanities for 3 years at RPI. Hello, I'm Larry Smith, and I've been asked to give the capstone lecture on ethics again. I've been doing this for many, many, many years. And because of COVID-19, we're taping it. I also think that, given my advanced age, there's a belief that they better get this on tape in case I am no longer here or don't have the faculty to do it in the future. For a little bit of background, my credentials: I'm on the board of directors of the NIEE, National Institute of Engineering Ethics. And I had a fellowship in engineering ethics in the 1970s from the National Endowment for the Humanities for 3 years at RPI. And I'm on the National Board of Governors of the Order of the Engineer, the ring ceremony. And been lecturing down here at least 20 years on ethics. I've lectured at other schools. And just to prove the naysayers wrong, I'm going to do this without notes. I've lived most of it. We'll start with the Citi Group Building, which was built in New York City on Lexington Avenue at 57th Street, I believe. It's a 69-story high building, but it's somewhat unique. It sits on 4 columns, 90 feet up in the air before they start counting floors. And the property was across from the Citigroup's original offices. They always wanted to buy it, but there was a church on the location, St. Philip's. And St. Philip's was old and run down, but they weren't willing to move. So the deal was that they would sell to the Citigroup, but the church had to be maintained on the property. The Citigroup offered to build them a new one, modern, that would fit in with the proposed building. And that was accepted, but it was written into the sale that no part of the Citigroup building could touch the church. It had to be freestanding and apart. And the Planning Commission in New York had great plans for some open space on the property. So they came up with a great idea, spectacular idea. They would build a church and above it, I'll take this out for now. In 4 columns, they would build the Citi Group Building, and this was about 90 feet, 9 stories. And above that would be a 69-story building. And the church would sit under it, and on the other open side, they'd have open plaza for public use and seating. And it would be a center core with elevators in it. And this is a unique design that normally we would expect the columns to be here at the corners, carry the conventional loads. The architect was Stubbins. They went to the Measure Associates, located in Cambridge. Bill Measure was on the faculty at Tech MIT and was a world-renowned structural engineer. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, what the, you know, I mean,
But the idea with which Mr. LeMessurier came up was a series of chevron frames. And instead of the load being carried down, we picked up on these diagonals and brought to these center columns. You may have mentioned that the longest cantilever here was 75 feet. It's also cantilevered out in 2 directions for the corners. So this would carry all the loads to the center column and down. On the outside of the building. The architect didn't think it was that notable. So it was in there, Mr. LeMessurier said God would see it. Everything was fine. The building was built, was completed. They were occupying, they were leasing it. And a graduate student, and you were sent a copy of an article that appeared in the New Yorker, there was an error in it. The author was told that a graduate student had contacted Mr. LeMessurier. He assumed an engineering graduate student would be a man. It was a woman. And she called LeMessurier. LeMessurier always admitted to being an egotist, saying she had questions. So he broke into a busy schedule and he spoke with her at length and explained a number of issues and a number of things, errors that her professor was making, and assured that the columns were in the correct place, that was designed for that, and it was an outstanding design and was brilliant. And she shared some things with him that she had calculated. She was doing her master's thesis, and it was to recreate the calculations, given the framing system. And he talked to her about different winds, etc. Hung up, got thinking about it, and he had some people look into it. And they found out there were some major issues. When it was designed, the columns, remember what, I think, intermediate points. They had checked it for wind perpendicular to the faces of the building. Why? Because that's what the code required. That's for what the code called. But the code wasn't written with this configuration in mind. It should have been checked for winds coming at the corner, what sailors refer to as quartering winds. And when they checked it for quartering winds, they found the stresses were much higher than they had originally expected. And you basically get forces working on two sides with quartering winds, whereas when you come in head on, you only have forces in one direction. And these can feed off each other. So originally the design had called for all the connections to be welded on the diagonals. Weld, weld, weld. Those are all supposed to be welded, but interestingly, about 2 weeks before the young lady had contacted Mr. LeMessurier, he called the New York office. And this was designed in Cambridge, but the New York office was in charge of overseeing the construction, handling the submittals, etc., to ask him about the welding because they were proposing another building, and the contractor said that the welding would be way too expensive, take too much time. They didn't have enough qualified welders, so they were just going to bolt it. And he called the New York office to find out if there was a long delay because of the welding, and had been told that, well, no, based on how strong the structure was, the contractor there had said the same thing. He didn't want to weld it. So they allowed him to go to bolts. It was bolted at a considerable savings in time and money. And using the data they had from the wind loads, etc., they had checked the bolts and they were fine. And when they checked that, by the way, Murphy's Law, that if anything can go wrong, it will go wrong. Murphy was an optimist. When they checked the design, these members, diagonals, they didn't check them as columns. They were checked as part of a truss. If they'd been checked as a column, it would have had a much higher factor of safety requirement. So the connections and the bolts were designed, one, with the wrong wind forces, and two, with a much lower factor of safety because it was treated as a truss, as a column. Mr. Lemessurier got very, very nervous, and he flew up to Canada, where there's an outstanding expert on wind loads on structures. And they had done some of the original modeling, again, based on the perpendicular wind loads, not the quarter. And they input that, and they kept running through it. And Mr. Lemessurier asked that they be honest with him. They came out and they told him, you got a problem. Based on their calculations, the structure could be taken down by a 16-year storm. And a 16-year storm is not tremendous winds. It's the storm that you can expect once every 16 years. And anything above that would be a danger. And Mr. Lemessurier came back, sat with some of his key people, went off to think about it, and he knew this could ruin his reputation. It could bankrupt him. At one point, he considered committing suicide and figured that was the coward's way out, and knew he had to do something because lives could be at risk. And he contacted the architect contacted the Citi Group. The Citi Group, they finally got to somebody because they saw at the top and no one was taking their calls. They got to somebody and told them there was a major problem. They had to come down and speak to them. So they flew down to New York and they had a meeting, and interestingly, it was held on the 30th floor of this building. And what's interesting about that is their calculations that they did for the ultimate repairs showed that the weakest point, the point most likely to fail, was on the 30th floor. So they were sitting next to it. And they came up with the idea of welding plates over each one of these bolted connections. And they thought it could be done at night. And they would have a drywall crew come in, cut out the drywall in each location, weld on the plates, knock off, and have a drywall crew come back in, restore it, paint it, so that the tenants wouldn't see anything different when they came in the morning, but they had to tell them. So they prepared a press release for the tenants, and the newspapers got hold of it. And the New York Times called Mr. Lemessurier, asking him why this work had to be done. So he went and had a few drinks and spoke to a lawyer, and they decided he had to get back to them. So he called the report, the New York Times, and an answer machine came on saying that because of the newspaper strike that had started that afternoon, no one was available. So he didn't have to deal with the press. They also installed strain gauges at key locations through the building, and they were going to have a full monitoring crew to watch the readings from those. So if they started to get heavy winds, they would know if the building had to be evacuated. And that was installed. And interestingly, when it was installed in a rush, they didn't use union labor. And while the work was going on, they were monitoring. They suddenly lost all the signals. They found that all the lines from the strain gauges had been cut in multiple locations. They were never able to get it back up. They always attributed that to payback for not using the union. No one's sure. They also met with the city to let the city know why they were doing this and asked them to be very quiet about it. And the building had a two-mast damper at the top. It was basically a huge block of concrete floating on oil, held by springs and electrical system. And its mast would repel movement of the building. And they do that in a lot of high-rises, skyscrapers, keep people from getting seasick up at the top. And that was considered critical in keeping this building safe until the repairs could be made. So they brought in a crew to babysit it and installed emergency generators because they realized in a hurricane would have come, they were going to lose the power. So they took that into account. And they went in and they started welding on the 30th floor. And I don't know how they figured out that that was a key point. It's beyond me. But as they welded it, they would redo their calculations and come up with the next critical point. So they kept hopping around through the building. And they were about halfway through when the hurricane, named Hurricane Ella, was coming up the coast, was passing Cape Hatteras. And the early predictions were it was going to hit New York City. And that's when the real panic set in. Incidentally, the Red Cross, after this all came out, did an estimate if the building had collapsed towards the north, which was probable, and all the buildings were occupied at the time, between 200,000 and 250,000 people could be killed. It would be a domino effect, building collapsing after building. Someone was on their side because the storm veered from going west, turned to the northeast, passed out to sea, didn't hit New York City. They finished the work. Mr. LeMessurier was considered a hero in New York City because not only had he identified the problem, but he came with a solution. And it's a solution that worked. And while they were doing the work, they did some other bracing. And when it was done, they had the wind specialists rerun their calcs and would withstand a 700-year storm. So he became a hero. It's one of the cases where the fix works. When the Tower of Pisa was being built, it started sinking immediately. So when the first floor was up, it tilted. So the builders decided they would lengthen the columns on the side that it tilted, so the next floor would be level, not realizing that they were increasing the load on the side that was weak and sinking. That wasn't something that worked, but this did. And interestingly, Citi Group settled for his insurance limit. They didn't want any contribution from him or his firm, just up to the insurance. And they ate the rest. And even more incredibly, his insurance company didn't count it in his rate experience because they were just so thrilled that it had been resolved. So here's a case of somebody faced up to the problem, came out and admitted it, and came with a solution. And if there's a problem, you can't just hide it.
Interestingly, this work was done in 1978. The New Yorker article was written in 1995. No one had heard about it. It is believed that LeMessurier was the person who contacted the reporter to write the article because he wanted to make sure if it ever came out, it came out. with his story. And he was received as a hero in the engineering profession. I had a friend who was one of the premier structural engineers in the country, and he was outraged. He said Lemessurier and his group made serious blunders that a first-year graduate student doing a master's found. And if it wasn't for her, we would have had a disaster at some point. And that the measure was not the one who was the hero, it was the woman. And he also said it was an unusual structure, and they analyzed it in an unusual manner, and that was unthinkable. And the welded connection should have been as a minimum, because when you weld something, the weld's as strong as the steel. When you bolt it, now you're concerned about the gusset plates and the strength of the bolt. So it becomes a total different story. And he also said when you're dealing with such a structure that was so far off the wall, you should always analyze it for the worst case. So the chevron should have been analyzed for columns and not trusses, because you're not looking to save steel. You're looking to make it as safe as possible. And as a little aside, when I was in Italy and went to the Tower of Pisa, the tour guide was a civil engineer. He could make more money as a tourist guide during the season. And we were talking, and he's the one who told me about the columns being lengthened on the side that was sinking. His comment was, leave the Stenots would put more weight on it. So I'm going to do a couple more short cases, and these will go quicker. Any questions in the chat box?
Not yet.
Okay, why don't we do the Ford Pinto?
Okay, very good.
Next, I think we'll talk about the famed Pinto case, the Ford Pintos. Back in the 1970s, small cars were coming out to compete with the foreign imports. And Ford came out with the Pinto that they rushed in the design and the manufacture. And they were fine for what you paid for them. And this is before the internet. And back in the days when people paid for long distance calls, so most calls were local. So we didn't have cell phones, we didn't have the internet. But a group of lawyers were at a plaintiff's conference, plaintiff's attorney's conference, and they were talking. And one of them said he had a case where Pinto was rear-ended and burst into flames and people were severely scarred. Well, the other lawyer said, I got one of those too, and there's another one that I know of. And the third lawyer there said, I don't have any of those cases, but I know someone who does. So it was a big convention. They started asking around, and this was not uncommon, that these Pintos, when being rear-ended, would burst into flames. So they started a class action suit. And in the discovery, this is a sad day for the engineering profession. They found that Ford was aware of the problem. They did an economic analysis. They knew how many Pintos they had sold. They knew the accident rate that caused fires. And from those, they knew the death rate. They knew the rates of people scarred, burned. And they knew what those lawsuits was, or what they would settle. They did a calculation as to what it would cost to fix the problem and what it would cost to pay off the lawsuits. It was a lot cheaper to pay off the lawsuits. Of course, Ford denied this entered into their thinking process. But what they were saying was, no, we value human life. We value people being scarred for life. But we value that bottom line more. And they denied it. But the fix was basically to build a metal casing around the back of the fuel tank, which was in the rear near the bumper. So in an accident, it would come in and shatter it. And subsequently, somebody who worked at Ford was in their recall division. And they would evaluate data and statistics. He wrote an article about it. His contention was that they didn't see it as being that big a problem, and that the issue was happening with other makes of that similar sized car. They attributed it to the small size of the car, not to their design flaw. But it goes down as one of the case histories of what not to do. But do we learn from it? And the automotive industry seems to be one of the worst offenders. More recently, in the 2010s, we had the GMC ignition matter. The engineers at GMC were given the charge to redo the ignition system, make it better, and make it cheaper. They achieved one of the two. It actually brings to mind an old engineering saying that in engineering you can get things cheap, you can get things good, and you can get things fast. But you can only get two of the three at any given time. Well, when they were doing the redo of the ignition system, they made it cheaper, they didn't make it better. And the electrical part that was put in was larger than the previous one. So the springs in the ignition switch had to be changed, and they put in smaller springs. What would happen is people would be driving down the highway. If they had extra keys on their key ring or a rabbit's foot, beer opener, they could pull the keys out of the ignition. It would kill the motor, and people would panic. And if they were in an accident, the airbags would not deploy because they won't come on if the engine is not running. GMC learned of this. They went back and they redesigned the switch. Never told anybody. And the real smoking gun is when they redesigned the switch. They didn't give it a new part number. In the automotive industry, anytime you change a part in the lease, it gets a new number. They didn't do it, so when the recall finally came, nobody knew for a certain year which cars had the defective switch and which didn't. And that didn't help matters. I served on the Rhode Island Board of Registration. The issue of making a major change to a part, but giving it the same part number, was definitely believed to be a cover-up so they wouldn't have to do a recall. But in doing that, one, they were trying to hide it, and two, they blurred the lines as to what would have to be replaced and recalled, because they made the switch and phased it in. So cars from a certain model year could have one or the other, and no one knew which. And getting back to the Ford Pinto, the
apologetic that the guy who wrote when he said he just thought it was coming out of small car design. He tried to discount the calculations that had been done as just what people want to know is what it would cost, but it wasn't used by a Ford decision not to make the change. So we can all evaluate that ethically. The next case, when we go to it, we'll have a brief discussion. We'll get everybody back to work. We can cut to that, Chad.
Oh, I got a question, Larry.
Okay.
How did the design responsibilities and regulations differ between civil and other industries like auto and aero?
Civils are registered engineers. They have full responsibility. Auto and aero, everybody's under the industrial exemption. So there are really no externals there. They may have to deal with the National Transportation Safety Board after the fact. But as far as the design, that is all internal, and the decisions that are made. So there is no regulatory group above them. There used to be an aeronautical PE exam given, but it fell into disuse. And a lot of the industrial exemption, which is always an issue, there are a lot of industries that discourage people from getting registered because say, why subject yourself to outside regulation? That's all done in-house. But everybody should have that responsibility for public health, welfare, and safety, regardless of registration.
Thank you.
For over 20 years, was the principal investigator on most of our discipline cases. And one of the things that I did find was people usually knew what the right thing was to do and what the wrong thing was, but they chose not to do it. That's where the ethics has to come into it. I'll share the story of a young man against whom a disciplinary complaint was filed at the Board of Registration. This is all public record. I'm not going to mention any names, but he worked for a small surveying firm as the in-house engineer on subdivisions, etc. And there was a slow time in the economy. So he would find things to keep him out of the office because he didn't want to be sitting around strumming on the old banjo, bring attention to the fact he didn't have a lot to do. And one morning the phone rang, his boss answered it. And it was a wealthy individual who was building a Hummer house in McMansion. And they were having structural issues with it. It was wood frame construction. And when they would open the doors, the entire house would shake. And the contractor told them, well, once the drywall goes up, that'll lock it in. And the drywall went up. They were still having issues, and there were other things that were bouncing around. So the doctor had decided to fire the contractor and not pay his open bill until he found out what it was going to cost to remedy. Hired a new contractor, and the new contractor said, you're going to have to get an engineer in here. We'll take down the drywall so they can see everything, get it figured out. But they're going to have to tell me what I have to do to fix it. So this doctor called on that particular day, and the young man's boss was there. He says, oh, we have an engineer here who's a specialist in wood framing. Those are rare hard to find. Most structural engineers, if they do it, it's as a specialty. And the doctor said it's going to be for an arbitration. He said, I'm not paying the guy his bill. As a matter of fact, I'm probably going to need money back from him according to my contract. So we'll need to know what needs to be done. The contract will price it out. You won't have to. He said, and his boss says, well, right now he's not here. Coincidentally, he's out looking at something very similar. I'll have him call you when he gets in. The young man arrived at work. His boss told him, you got to call this doctor, and you got to tell him you're experienced in arbitrations. He says, I'm not. He said, you know the last 2 times you were sued, you had to go testify. Those were arbitrations, so you're experienced. And tell him that you're an expert on wood framing. He says, well, I'm not. He says, well, buy a book, become an expert. He says, there isn't a lot for you to do around here right now. We finally have something to come in that we can bill on. And you'll give me your excuses why you can't do it. Now go call the guy. Calls the doctor, goes up, meets with him, says, I'll have to write you a proposal, goes back, tells his boss, I don't think I'm qualified for this. His boss says, well, you tell me you're not qualified, period. So he writes a proposal, they fax it to the doctor signs it, now he has to get going. He goes up there and really doesn't know even what he's looking at. He was the only engineer in the office, didn't have anyone to speak to. Was not active in any of the engineering societies. I'm going to put on a different hat right now. I've been the senior advisor to the ASCE Rhode Island section. Getting close to 30 years now. I make almost all the meetings. I recommend everyone has one you network. And when I owned my firm, I did pick up work. That's not why I did it. But more than that, I met people. I found out what their area of expertise was. I had a question in an area, I could call someone. He didn't have that open to him. So he goes up with one of the surveyors with a video cam. And they're going through this. The surveyor is videotaping him. They're up in the attic, and he's shaking things. And he said, I don't think it should be shaking like that. And he looks at the grade stamp on the lumber. It says KDSP. He says, oh wow, it's Southern Pine. That's really strong. KDSP is kiln dry spruce. You can't get anything worse. Well, maybe if it's made out of balsa wood. That's the stuff they sell in the big box stores usually. You would normally frame it using hemp fur. So this was on the videotape. And he started asking the contractor, well, what do you think should be done here? What do you think should be done with this? What do you think's wrong? The contractor said to me, hey kid, you're supposed to tell me. I'm not supposed to tell you. If I knew what to do, I would do it. So I went back, and he was told he had to submit something by the end of the week to the arbitrator. The arbitrator was dual degreed. He was an engineer, and then he went over to the dock side, became a lawyer. So he was going to be well versed. He didn't have anything to send him, so he sent him the videotape. And the lawyer / engineer sent back a note that you have to give me chapter, book, and verse from the building code. And cite the violations. I need your calculations. I'll need them before the arbitration next week. So you'll have till Monday to submit them. The arbitration's on Wednesday. So faced with that, he did the only thing he could think of at the time. No, he didn't consider suicide. He went and told his boss, you know, things are really slow, so why don't I take my vacation time now? So when things pick up again, I'll have it out of the way. Boss says, good idea. So the following Wednesday, they get a call from the arbitrator asking where the engineer is. And the boss says, oh, he's on vacation for 2 weeks. He must not have known. The arbitrator said, yeah, he knew. So his decision was that the first contractor would be paid $70,000, and the first contractor wouldn't have to give anything back. They're expecting back about 50 grand. So there's going to be a swing of about $120,000. The doctor went to a lawyer. In fact, it was a lawyer representing the arbitration. He said, there's got to be a board that regulates these people. So they filed a complaint. I was the investigator on it. And the young man wasn't returning the calls, so I got one side of the story. And he had gone to his boss now. He was really upset. He said, I told you I didn't want to do it. He says, it'll be all right. He says, I'll have the lawyer who represents the company represent you in front of the board. And that way you won't have any expenses. He's very good and he has political connections and knows some of these guys. So he came in with the lawyer, and the lawyer basically threw him under the bus because he wasn't there representing the young man, he was there representing the firm because they knew a lawsuit was coming. They were going to get ready for the slap shot. And we realized what was going on, and partway through, the young man realized what was going on. So we took all that into account, and he was disciplined for practicing outside his area of expertise. We could have been a lot harsher on him. And we gave him 3 to 6 months for suspension. And they had to run an ad in the Providence Journal in the business section, back when the Providence Journal had a business section. They run a classified ad saying that he had been suspended and giving the dates. Well, that happened, and his firm had been doing work for community, designing a pier for them, and he was supposed to appear in front of the planning board in that town, field any questions and get input. And it was going to be a night meeting, and it was after the suspension had been noticed. And Murphy's Law was the day after the ad appeared in the newspaper. And he told his boss he couldn't go. His license was suspended. And his boss was nice, told him, you know, you're worth even less to me now not being registered because you can't stamp anything. You can go because you're not doing engineering work. You're doing answers and questions based on what you had done while you were registered. So you can go. So he went. And there were other engineers at the meeting. And there was an engineer on the board. Next morning, I went to my office, and my voicemail, I had 3 voicemails from 3 engineers who'd been at the meeting, telling me that they had seen the ad in the Projo, and he was there practicing that night. And we got a couple of calls at the Board of Registration. We got the minutes of the meeting, and we called him in. And this time he came with his own lawyer, and he came with his wife. And his wife came with their infant daughter, baby in arms, to sit by him. And he told us that his boss basically threatened him that if he didn't go, and his boss told him it was okay to go because he wasn't going to be practicing engineering, he was just doing questions and answers on what he had done. And they asked him, didn't that give you cause for concern? He said, yeah. He said, but he has a wife and a young baby and a mortgage. And he didn't think he could tell his boss no and not get fired, so he did it. And we were easy on him again. We gave him a concurrent 6-month suspension to run with the first. And after the meeting, I went over, I told him how much we had been easy on him, that he could have lost his license for good. And I said, you've got to get to a place in your profession where you're not dependent upon having to take orders from an unreasonable boss. I said, nothing good's going to come of it. You can get your license back in about another 5 months. And what's he going to make you do next? So during that time, he went to work for a bigger firm, got his license back. And eventually, as a result of this incident, he chose to leave engineering and go into another science-based profession. The moral and the takeaway from this is, if it feels wrong, don't do it. You have to be careful, and you have to think it out, think it through. Because if you're told to do something by your immediate superior, and you tell him why you don't want to do it, or tell her why you don't want to do it, then you put yourself in a position that they tell you to go ahead and do it. You have to go over their head. If you go over their head, and whoever you go to agrees with your superior, you're in a tough spot. And if they agree with you, you're still in a tough spot. So it's not an easy thing to do, and it can have repercussions and ramifications. You never do wrong by doing right. Thank you.
One final comment. In the last case, I mentioned a babe in arms. When I was down at URI a number of years back, giving an ethics lecture, we were showing an NIE video, and afterwards I was going to lead a discussion in it. And I happened to look at the sign-in sheet of attendance, and I realized that the baby who had been brought to that meeting was sitting in that classroom. There was a odd last name. I recognized it immediately. And again, I had to ad lib because I wasn't going to present that case, even though it's public record. I figured she was going to know exactly about whom I was talking, so it wasn't appropriate. Any questions?
Yes, Larry, we have a couple questions. Could any action be taken against the young man's boss?
He was not a registered engineer, so we couldn't take actions against him. He was a licensed surveyor, and the surveyors at that time was still battling the engineers over what engineers could do survey-wise. We didn't feel it was going to be receptive.
Okay, we have another question. Do you think that university engineering curriculums adequately prepare young professionals to tackle ethical dilemmas they will likely face throughout their careers? Does this responsibility fall to employers?
I think it needs to be started at the university level, and ethics has to be an integral part of what is taught. And as I said, in all the disciplinary cases, I was on the PE board for 20 years. We never had a case where someone didn't know what to do. They just chose not to do it. But it has to be taught, and it also has to be in the ethic fiber of the firm.
Thank you. One more thing, Larry. I wanted to introduce the new ASCE Code of Ethics. It was released in October. Are you familiar with it?
I am familiar with it, and I'm not happy with it.
Okay.
The old Code of Ethics used to be prescriptive, thou shalt not. And this was more run as bullet points of what you should do. They try to put it positively. And by the way, I was not alone in that opinion.
I think it was developed over at least a year, and there was quite a bit of member feedback on it. And one of the new things is a ranking of the responsibilities. It's starting with the first and working their way down. They're not saying to disregard any of them, but if you should have a conflict between two codes, the one that is higher should rule, is how it's been set up.
Chad, I'm also seeing one other question. How does an engineer explain their limitations in their field of expertise to the client or general public?
Basically, if they feel they are not suitable for the project, they shouldn't take it. And if you have to explain to your client what they're supposed to, your limitations are, then you're not comfortable with the assignment. They should be comfortable with taking it.
Thank you.
Chad, do we have any other questions?
I think that is it.
Do we have any viewers?
Yes, we had over 50 viewers at one point. I did check in on YouTube. So I think we had a good crowd today, Larry. Thank you again for your time with us today. In lieu of our standard speaker gift, the Rhode Island section of ASCE has made a $100 donation to the Order of the Engineer. Our next event is currently scheduled for Wednesday, January 20th in 2021 at noontime. Please reach out to us at riasce@gmail.com and provide us some suggestions for our next topic and future topics. We're still looking for a speaker for that session. I'd like to thank President-elect Chad Morrison for coordinating and producing today's event. And that concludes our presentation today. Please keep an eye open for future invitations, and thank you all for joining us.